Welcome to the Solution Nation podcast. My name is Sean Snowday, and I'm the president of Solution Nation. Solution Nation is dedicated to providing a platform for investors to learn about Israel's most dynamic public and private companies. We interview lead venture capitalists, Wall Street analysts, investment bankers, and managers of incubators and accelerators. Today's guest is Danielle Abraham, and our topic is transforming African agriculture with Israeli innovation. Now, Danielle Abraham discusses how Israeli know-how is being directed to boosting agriculture output in Africa. She discusses the state of African farming infrastructure, the role of extension officers, and the magnitude of minimizing post-harvest losses. The podcast addresses the importance of government stability, involvement of China in Africa, and Africa's receptivity to Israeli knowledge transfer. Please remember that all content provided on the Solution Nation podcast and website is for educational purposes only. Nothing shall be construed as investment advice. Investment decisions shall not be made based on information, written, verbal, or otherwise, posted or spoken on Solution Nation. Conduct your own research or consult with your own investment advisors before making investment decisions. So here's my good friend, the host of the show, and the CEO of Solution Nation, David Wanatik.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Solution Nation podcast series. I'm David Wanatik. Today, we have a very interesting session. The focus of today's program is transforming African agriculture with Israeli innovation. Speaking on this subject, very pleased to welcome Danielle Abraham. She is the executive director at Volcani International Partnerships. Danielle has spent her career in Israel dedicated to connecting Israeli expertise to needs in developing countries. She has previously served as a senior policy advisor in MASHAV, Israel's Agency for International Development Cooperation at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and represented Israel as a guest speaker at the UN, OECD, and the German Development Bank. Danielle, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. Pleasure.
So please tell us a little bit about the Volcani International Partnerships.
Yes, so we're a nonprofit organization based both in Israel and in the US. And our mission is really to address issues of global food and nutrition insecurity using Israel's agricultural experience, expertise, technologies, but primarily also Israel's capacity to innovate. Because if you understand anything about Israeli agriculture or what's happened in Israel, it's obvious to say that Israel is not a natural nor sensible place to do agriculture. You know, it's a tiny country, it's 2/3 desert. Associated with that, it has poor soil and a lack of water. And situated in a rather difficult neighborhood, you know, its export markets were just that much further afield. And therefore, what Israel did in a very short space of time to transform its agriculture has meant Israel has so much to offer the rest of the world as they grapple with these challenges, and even more so in climate change. So as a nonprofit organization, we're organizing Israel's agricultural expertise, experience, and technologies, and working with partners, whether they're governments, foundations, or private entities around the world to help them advance their food and nutrition security.
Okay, so the Volcani International Partnerships itself, is that a privately funded organization, or does it receive government funding or international funding? And then a second question, is most of your work in terms of agriculture directed towards Africa, or do you also do work in other parts of the world, India or Southeast Asia, for instance?
So in terms of funding, unfortunately, we do not get any support from the Israeli government. Yeah, that's something I'm working on. I would like to see happen in the future. We get most of our funding actually from revenue generating services that we sell, and also from some foundations and philanthropy that supports our projects. At the moment, we are not just in Africa. I mean, just this summer, I was out in the Bahamas with a team of Israel's leading agricultural experts, scientists and agronomists, trying to provide some advisory services to the Bahamian government. We were there with the Minister of Agriculture. They were hit very hard when COVID happened because they're importing more than 90% of their food. And so they turned to us and said, could Israel help us understand how we could, relaunch an agricultural sector, focusing specifically on these agricultural cultivation hubs, cultivation centers. So not just in Africa, but also in Africa.
Okay. We'll spend most of the time talking about what you're doing in Africa. Before we talk about agriculture, maybe we can just say a few words about the Jewish community in Africa. Africa is a big continent. My guess would be the biggest communities of Jewish people are in South Africa, maybe Ethiopia, maybe Morocco still. Anything you would like to say about that?
Yes, so I'm not an expert on the Jewish communities across Africa, but I have had the privilege and pleasure of spending some of the Chagim with different Jewish African communities. I did Yom Kippur both in South Africa, in Cape Town, where I was shocked to see the vibrancy of the Jewish community. It was a really wonderful experience. And you can probably tell from my accent, I'm originally from London. And the synagogue experience there did remind me more so of my, Ashkenazi upbringing in the United Synagogue in England, in the Orthodox setting. And that was really wonderful, together with the choir. And I was also lucky enough to have the opportunity to spend another Yom Kippur in Uganda with the Abba Yudea Jewish community, which was nothing like my experience I'd had in London or in South Africa. They were so warm and welcoming, and you could see the influences, the Ugandan influences weaved in to their interpretation of the songs with the melodies, and the commitment to their Judaism was really incredibly impressive. So I've had the opportunity to spend 2 Chagim in those Jewish communities, and they were very vibrant and both wonderful in different ways.
Great. So maybe for people that aren't aware, you could tell us a little bit about Africans in Israel. For those that are not aware, there's a lot of Ethiopian Jews in Israel. Maybe you could say a few words about that. And to the extent there's guest workers from Africa in Israel would be interesting.
Yeah, so the Ethiopian Jewish community goes back, several decades when they were airlifted out of Ethiopia to Israel. It was very important to the state, and actually efforts are still going on today to take out the last Ethiopian Jews out of Ethiopia, as far as I understand. I do think they face some challenges integrating into Israeli society. I don't think it was as good as some of us with the Zionist dream would have hoped, or as easy for them as I would have wanted it to be. But they are here in Israel, Israelis, Jewish members of society. You can also see there are guest workers from Africa, if that's the right term. And we've also got African asylum seekers or refugee communities, primarily from Eritrea and Sudan. And actually, as an NGO, we completed a wonderful project for that community here in Israel. We introduced a hydroponics growing system with a foundation called Growing Peace in a food pantry in South Tel Aviv, because when COVID hit, some of these asylum seeker refugee communities were really badly hit. And this food pantry was open to serve, their food needs. But obviously, most of the goods were dried goods. And so by installing hydroponic systems, actually, we could enable the produce of fresh produce on a monthly basis. They could actually take that home. A small project in Israel.
Great, thank you. So now we can talk about the work that the Volcani International Partnerships engages in. You mentioned that the Bahamas invited Israel to help them with their agricultural issues. Is that typically the way it works? Do the countries reach out to you, or do you determine which African countries have the greatest need or the greatest potential given their soil and temperature and so forth? How do you direct your efforts?
So in a strange universe, which is not the norm, we have actually done no business development yet as a nonprofit organization, which means we have not proactively gone out to seek projects. We are normally inundated with requests and, for partnership, for assistance, which I think is a wonderful testament to the knowledge and expertise that Israel has as a state in this area. And sadly, the increasing need on a global scale, for agricultural solutions, especially when you're looking at climate change, the increasing semi-arid, arid nature of the land and the lack of water. So what has happened is we've received requests from abroad, and we have to assess, which ones should we prioritize and which ones can we address. Now, I know, and I'll share my philosophy with you, that Israel has so much to offer. And so my biggest question is, how can we enhance or maximize the impact that we have? And my position is that we need very, very strong partners on the ground. Because whilst we have wonderful expertise here, both in the scientists in Israel and the agronomists, and of course, we've got all of the agri-tech companies behind with the solutions, we don't have enough people to be on the ground around the world full time. And therefore, we need very, very strong partners on the ground with whom to go in for a project. So in the case of the Bahamas, they did reach out to us, and typically that is what happens. Yet at the same time, we have been busy trying to create strategic partnerships with other entities and organizations. And one such organization, which might be interesting for you to know about, is the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. So Tony Blair has an organization where he positions advisors in the highest levels of governments, primarily across Africa. So they might be sitting in the president's office or the prime minister's office, and, several line ministries wherever their focus is. And their role is really to enhance good governance, because we really believe that enables or disables anything. And so what we've done there is we've created a partnership. Right before COVID, we actually signed the agreement, but obviously everything was derailed because of COVID, and we're now picking things back up. And the idea is that they perform the governance piece and we bring in the agricultural expertise from Israel. So actually just next week, we'll be on the ground in Angola, together with the TBI team, who are based within the government in Angola, and the TBI head of agriculture, because Angola now has a new government and they've been working on a 5-year plan for agricultural development. And there are key issues or challenges within that plan that they believe, and we agree, that Israel could be best placed to address. So that for me is a priority, because I believe that with this partnership going into Angola, our chances for success are maximized. So
okay.
That's what I'm thinking.
So it seems like your decision to help various countries is based on the Tony Blair Institute making a determination that the country politically is ready to accept new ideas. There's some kind of rule of law, not terribly a large amount of corruption. And then your organization looks at the feasibility of agriculture in that country, and then also the desire of the country to embrace your ideas. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, they TBI also in different offices or governments around the country, and we would be looking at, the countries where they're focused on agriculture, where we believe we have a comparative advantage that we could actually contribute value. And that is just one example of one specific partnership that we've created, because we believe it's more effective to go in with strong partnerships on the ground. And that's also a great example of, what I call top-down approach, really going from the government top down. I also believe that we could have a great impact by going bottom up. Mm-hmm. And we've designed a program based on Israel's experience called the Israel Africa Pioneer Program. It's about identifying leading agricultural entrepreneurs, African agricultural entrepreneurs, who have a track record of success. So an existing farm, for example, who are already growing in a more sophisticated way as a business, and who are already impacting the communities around them, either by serving as off-takers or by training the community. And what we are planning to do is to provide those leading agricultural entrepreneurs with 2 years of agricultural support from Israel, really like Israeli farmers would have received. And we were planning to launch in 2020, which was put on hold again because of COVID, but we're hoping to launch in Malawi in 2023 with our first pioneer called Nagawa Chatata, and possibly then look at Tanzania.
So are you more optimistic about helping countries that have a bit of socialism, that have the government owning a lot of the land? Because that's sort of the way it was in Israel in the beginning with the kibbutzim. That was a socialist thought, socialist practice. And it worked. It worked in the early days for Israel, which is maybe where Africa is today. Or are you more inclined to look at countries that have more free enterprise? Because we're taught that, you get more productivity if people are motivated and have free enterprise.
So I don't think I can generalize and state one or the other. I do believe it's important to have, free enterprise. That's my gut feeling today. I think you have to do both. The government has to create an effective enabling environment with policies, regulation around so many different issues. But I think you need those entrepreneurs on the ground pushing the envelope. I think that's the only way we're going to see real change today. I think you need both working together. That's in an ideal world. In Israel, yes, the kibbutz and the socialist approach really worked well. And interestingly, Israel, on its establishment, its GDP per capita was at a similar place to where many African nations are today. So that comparison is quite correct. I do think there were so many other factors and influences then at the time which enabled the socialist kibbutz approach to work, which means it's not necessarily transferable to other countries. So I wouldn't necessarily go and advocate for that approach in another country. I think it's very context and culturally dependent for the success. I think one interesting takeaway, which I hear a lot, is when I talk about how Israel managed to create this agricultural transformation. You know, we talk about the pioneers that came in the early days. You know, they believed there was no higher ideal than becoming a farmer and to work the land, when they could have had a wonderful middle-class upbringing and life as a doctor or something in Europe. They came here to work the land and to become a farmer. And they did it with such enthusiasm, really fueled by this ideology of Zionism. A lot of African partners say to me, Danielle, how did they convince the farmers in those days? How did you convince those early Israelis to come and become a farmer? We're really struggling with youth in Africa today to make farming attractive. And that's because they associate farming with poverty, you know, what their grandparents were doing. They don't see it as a potential fantastic business or necessarily, you know, as an agri-tech area. And if they do see it as an agri-tech area at all, my sense is they're more inclined to go into the technology side rather than the actual farming side. So I think if there's any key lesson from Israel, it's how you do that. And I think, and I really believe, one of my mentors, Professor Dov Pasternak, who sadly passed away, he always spoke about Toyota security and not food security for Africa. He spent many years in Niger. And he said, you know, we're not looking for food security, we're looking for Toyota security. Can our farmers aspire to be able to make enough money from their farming to buy a Toyota? And if yes, then we're doing something right. So farming has to be a business. That's what it is. And I think one of my issues with African agriculture today and the approaches adopted by so many is they're focused primarily and almost exclusively on staple food crops. And to my mind, that's a mistake. You look at what Israel did. It pursued staple food crops alongside, you know, commercial crops with an eye to the market, high value crops. And I think only in that context, you'll see the private enterprises emerging and the fertile ground, pardon the pun, because of the agriculture, for these startups and technologies to come in. So if you're looking at smallholder farmers who are really doing subsistence or whatever farming with staple food crops, that's not your audience for the technologies that we're seeing coming out of Israel.
Right. To what extent does improvements in infrastructure have to precede the work you're trying to do with agriculture? So you could have great ideas, you know, a reasonable government, but if you don't have the infrastructure for irrigation, electricity, if the markets are too far away and the roads are not good and the food, you know, perishes in route to the markets, you know, there's problems with that. So to what extent do we need infrastructure to precede the work you're doing?
I mean, in an ideal world, it would be there, right? If you're trying to maximize and get the best results possible, you really need all of that basic infrastructure. The question then becomes, do we wait for that? Or do we go in and see what we can done in the meantime, or hopefully develop it in parallel? My position is that we can't only wait for that. And I do believe improvements can be made even without that. You know, we were in the Bahamas looking at local systems. We were looking at rainwater harvesting and actually using that for the irrigation and trying to create a closed circular economy. So there are things that can be done on a very local, I don't want to say off-grid scale, without waiting for national infrastructure. But if we're looking for a complete agricultural transformation across a nation, the infrastructure is critical. The connections to the markets, also the export markets, you know, the cold value chain, all of these, the roads, everything along the whole value chain. I mean, even the basic questions right now, such as inputs for the farming, you know, what's available to the farmers, the seedlings, the fertilizer, especially in the wake of the impact of what happened, or is what's happening with Russia and the Ukraine. So the infrastructure and everything around that's very important.
Right. Is there a lot of competition for helping African countries with their agriculture from the Chinese? You know, the Chinese are, you know, heavily involved in Africa, doing a lot of things. But, you know, do you see Chinese kind of competing to assist the African countries with agriculture?
I feel like when we use the word compete, it makes it suggest that there's only one winner or the opportunity for one winner. My position is that the Chinese are very, very active across Africa. And I think we've been too slow in the West to recognize, exactly what they're doing and how they're doing it or take action one way or the other. But staying out of the politics, my position is that the need and the opportunity across the continent is so vast. There's space and scope for everybody to contribute. What that raises for me is another lesson from Israel. When you look back at what Israel did, we had a lot of money pouring in from the diaspora. I don't know, in England, we had the blue box, the JNF blue box, that everyone would put their charity in to support the state of Israel. And what was special then is that the Israeli government were very strong and they had a very clear national plan. And all the money flooding in would go to the government and they would dictate how it would be used. Right now we're working on the water pipeline from the Galilee down to the desert. This is maybe where we want to channel some of the money, or we're working on forestry, but the government dictated where all of this aid money coming in was going. And one of the critical challenges I see across Africa today is like a project management nightmare. They've got all these aid agencies coming in from everywhere and foundations and charities all working on their own projects, which on their own might be fantastic. But I'm not sure how many nations across Africa are really in control and ownership of a national development plan and making sure that everybody else falls into line behind that. So I don't envy their role, trying to organize all of this. And I think that's critically important. And so when we talk about the Chinese contributing, I just think, imagine you're an African government now and the Chinese are coming in, and what position you have to be in to accept that, but not be able to control or all these projects.
So that's a good point. Maybe there's an argument for partnering with an African country that's a bit less democratic, a bit more authoritarian, not to an extreme extent, but to be able to control the situation and not have all these charities and philanthropic organizations run the country many different directions. Maybe a little central control is not a bad thing.
Yeah, I'm not going to make any political comments. This is the joy of my job. I only talk agriculture. But first of all, it could be quite authoritarian and still have a lot of charities operating, and they might not have any control over there. They could in theory, but they might just, put their hands up and not actually dictate where the charities are operating or in what sectors with any key plan. I think development can take place in all kinds of conditions, really. It's just which ones are optimal and how best can we transfer the experience and the knowledge and the technologies that we have here in Israel on the ground for maximum impact. What conditions do we need from Israel? That's where I have my eye. How can we create an impact on the ground?
So it seems like you're most focused on offering consulting in terms of how to organize agriculture, technology that could accelerate the yields from agriculture. And that seems like it's directly helping the situation versus giving a lot of money to the governments, which not all of the money goes to the right places.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, we don't have that much money as an NGO.
Right,
so we don't have that dilemma. You're correct. So we are focused on advisory. We're focused on technology transfer, if and when relevant. And we let our experts determine what technologies could be appropriate. We send the experts out first to analyze the situation on the ground, and they are the ones that inform us what kind of technologies would work, would be appropriate for the setting, etc. And the other key piece that we're really pushing out is the know-how, building up capacity, primarily amongst farmers, but not only. And something we started, what you'll notice about how Israel did it, Israel invested very heavily in its extension services. Extension is, the agronomists. They're kind of the link between the R&D and the farmer. So if you're a farmer tomorrow and you want to go and set up a farm, your first port of call will probably be to your extension officer if you have one. They're the one that knows everything about the crop that you want to grow. They will advise you. You have a pest in the morning, you pick up your phone, you call your extension officer. They provide you with training. They're your go-to mentor for everything to do with the agronomy side. And Israel's extension service was incredibly strong. It was incredibly specialized. And, the ratio for farmers to extension officers was fantastic. If you go to Africa, on the other hand, the extension services are notoriously underfunded. I don't want to say non-existent, but facing significant challenges. And even if there are extension officers, it's not uncommon to see that they have clean hands and clean shoes. which we always joke is a bad sign because it means they're in the office and not in the field. And they might say, well, I've got a job, but there's no funds for me to have a car. So how am I going to get to the field? And so we've noted this as a huge, huge gap and an issue. And it was the same in the Caribbean. And just out of interest to work out how we can address this from Israel, we received a request from the Minister of Agriculture from the Bahamas. And he asked if we could help, 60 farmers do a course in smart farming. We're like, great, yeah, Israel's smart farming, agri-tech powerhouse, no problems. We put together a short course for that and for 60 Bahamian farmers, and we sent out the link for them to register. Well, I can tell you that within 5 days, the link went viral, and we had over 2,600 participants sign up from across the Caribbean, not just the Bahamas. And we realized we've hit on a pain point here. They are massively lacking access to experts, especially world-class experts like we have in Israel. So we noted that. We did the course. It was a fantastic success. We have about 4 or 5 WhatsApp groups on our phones now, connecting with all of these farmers across the Caribbean region. It goes off all night long, much to my husband's dismay because of the time difference. And we've noticed 2 things. Number 1, we've created vibrant communities so they can ask each other for peer-to-peer advice. But number 2, they have this access point now suddenly to Israel. Is Israel have any solutions on this? What would your experts say about this? Does anyone recognize this pest? Can you help? And so we've actually gone on to do some more capacity building education projects, both in person, but also online. And we're testing out this online platform for training. Now, we don't believe in agricultural training online because, agricultural training should be done in person in the field. But I think COVID made us all rethink about what we have to do if that's a necessity. And also, extension can be tricky. If you're in Africa, some of the countries are absolutely vast, unlike Israel. And if you're in the Caribbean, have people scattered across islands, and it's not cheap or easy to move around. So we are now playing with something we've called Israel AgriWeb, which is moving extension online and trying to create a holistic program which we can support farmers around the world. So consultancy, the technology, and the know-how. And of course, the last one is the R&D, which goes on to commercialization.
Right. Are there any crops that the Africans are very, very successful at growing that maybe they don't need so much assistance?
Listen, they are successful in many crops across the board. The question is, how successful do you want to be? I mean, we look at Israel's success, for example, and Israel's pushed the boundary of success, both in production and the water use efficiency. And I think today, with the pressures of climate change, we can always aspire to be better at what we're doing, exactly in the same way that Israel is. So I would suggest there's always scope for assistance, both to maximize productivity, which is really increasing yields, to maximize water use efficiency, which is really, how much crop can we get for our drop? We want to minimize the amount of water we use to maximize the output. And the third thing I would say is enhancing sustainability. It might be that they're fantastic at growing a certain crop, but they're spraying fertilizers all over the place or pesticides, which is not the most sustainable approach. And I would suggest that we want to move more in this direction of sustainability, trying to preserve our soils and our conditions for the next generation to ensure that we're not just successful today, but we can also be successful tomorrow.
Right.
I think Israel has a lot to offer.
Right. Yeah, I would imagine there's a lot of variability in terms of everything in Africa because it's such a large continent, from weather to terrain, soil, water, energy. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's a huge, huge continent. And the other area, if it's interesting, that Israel is a world leader in is minimizing post-harvest loss. Sometimes when we talk about agriculture, we're very much focused on how much are we growing, how many tons per hectare or whatever the measurement is. But actually, the statistics show that the worldwide average for post-harvest loss is at 20%. And some cases in Africa, it rise even to 40 to 50%, depending on the value chain and the conditions. And I believe the scientists are being modest in Israel, but they claim in Israel, our losses are down to 0.5%. I think it's closer to 0.25. And that is astounding. I present this figure even to the Brazilian delegation I had here in Israel last week, and they were really shocked. And even the Americans are shocked at how amazing the statistics and the results are that Israel has in post-harvest loss. So when we talk about food security, we must look at both the production, but also the storage. It doesn't help if we're producing double the amount if we're losing up to 40%, in the value chain afterwards. That's another critical area where Israel has wonderful expertise and also technologies.
So as you offer these consulting and education training services, will you recommend specific companies that can take care of different tasks and different jobs?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. We will. So we position ourselves as an NGO and we say we're neutral. We're not aligned to any company or technology at all. What we like to do is put the experts up front and center, exactly as Israel did it, have them analyze this situation, and then make a recommendation as to which companies from Israel preferably, but if they doesn't exist in Israel, then elsewhere, could actually help serve that community or that need.
Is there any resistance from the Israeli agricultural companies? Do any of them take the position that we can help solve the problem faster just by getting in there and offering our services, offering our products? We don't need to have a lot of seminars and education. Let us just go in there and take care of the problem. Do you ever get that sentiment from any companies?
I wish, because I think that would show that there are a lot of companies eager to get into Africa. I think going to Africa for an Israeli company is not simple at all. It's a challenging market for lots of different reasons. And if you're a startup specifically, because I feel like the agri-tech sector in Israel is largely young and emerging, why do you need the headache? You've got investors, you're trying to raise funds, you're trying to get proof of concept, you're trying to show success, start selling. Why go to a harder market when you can go to an easier market? We are working together, we have done in the past and possibly again this year, with the JDC. They have a program called Innovation Journey, where they're taking Israeli agri-tech startups or emerging companies and helping them enter African markets. Last year, when we advised them, it was for Ethiopia. And this year, they're looking at South Africa. And you can see that there are these push mechanisms coming out. I call that a push mechanism. They're trying to push Israeli companies into Africa. So we haven't hit that problem yet.
Okay. You have any stories to tell us about any revelations you've discovered in Africa, or anything that was very surprising to you, the way they conduct business or the way they do farming?
Not in that sense. I think the most interesting thing to me was the response when I say that I'm Israeli. In the most random places. I was out with the Rockefeller Foundation, I think it must have been 2018, in a really random rural Kenyan village. And we sat down for some tea, and I sat down next to one of the elders of the village, and she asked me where I'm from. And I said, I'm from Israel. She said, wow, Israel. I still have my Scouts uniform from Israel from, back in the 60s when Israel flooded the continent with agricultural experts. She said, Israel has a very special place in our heart because you were here helping us after we gained independence. And that for me was a huge aha moment. And I thought it was very powerful to see, how Israel was remembered in her mind specifically. And I have to share that that's the feeling I get across the continent. I am British, so I am European, but my gut feeling still today is that Israelis are received very differently on the continent to Europeans and others, and the Chinese. I think there's a different level of interaction. I feel like this potential, considering how Israelis are received, considering the challenges and climate change on the ground, and thinking about how much Israel has to offer. I believe Israel's agricultural expertise here is so vastly underutilized to promote the state of Israel, in terms of diplomacy and economy, but also in terms of tikkun olam, if we're allowed to use that phrase, repairing the world and actually creating impact. This is it.
I can imagine that organizations such as yours that are helping Africa with their agricultural production is winning the hearts and minds of lots of Africans, and is a tremendous diplomatic benefit to Israel. Not doing it for the diplomatic benefits, but it is a side product of all the great work you're doing. Are there any African countries that will not accept your assistance because you're Israeli? Your organization is Israeli?
So that is not so far. And we do have a project we're working to support the Dove Center, named after Dov Pasternak, Professor Dov Pasternak in Niger. There are no formal relations between Israel and Niger. We're also in conversation with some partners in Syria to actually see how our work can aid, the northeast region of Syria, which used to be the breadbasket of the region. They're really suffering right now from drought. It's really impacted their wheat. And I can share with you now that before the Abraham Accords, back in 2018, I think it was, I received a request from someone from one of the offices of one of the crown princes in the UAE. I said, is this for real? Oh, is this a joke? It's one of the scam emails. And it turned out it was real. And they were reaching out for assistance on horticultural crop production in desert conditions. And so very much under the radar, without any press or talking about it, we sent a team with foreign passports out to UAE then to advise the crown prince on horticultural growing in the desert. Now that the Abraham Accords has happened, it's wonderful to see everybody out there. But that was before the peace agreement. So to my mind, agriculture is wonderful because, people need it and they recognize what Israel has to offer. And my experience is that the door has always been open.
Right. Well, that was a good point that a lot of Israelis have dual citizenship. And if you need to, many Israelis can use a second passport. Well, great. Any final words you'd like to say?
No, I just hope that this subject gets more and more attention because I genuinely believe Israel has so much to offer the world here. And the world is in increasing need of this support. Food and nutrition security are only getting worse in the face of a growing global population and climate change. And there's so much, we already know the solutions. I don't want to end on a negative point, but we know what works. We have technologies, we have the know-how. It's just about how you put it together and make it work. And I feel like Israel has to play a leading role in that for the world to make it a better place. So.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. So I'd like to thank Danielle Abraham, Executive Director at the Volcani International Partnerships. She spoke to us about transforming African agriculture with Israeli innovation. So that was a great session. Thank you very much, Danielle.
Thank you for having me.